Welcome to part 3 of the Reasons to Believe series. We have Bruce Robertson with us today. How are you, Bruce?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing our conversations.
Yeah, it's been good so far. And today we are going to focus in on and pick up on the theme of meaning in the universe. And I'm excited to hear what you've got to say about that. Now, if you can think back to part 1, I know that was a while ago, we spoke about God being creator. So God created the universe, everything in it, everyone in it, including you and I. And he was the cause of all of this. So Bruce, prove it. How? Why? What's the deal? Can you prove to me that God actually did create the universe?
Okay, that's a really, really interesting question because I hear so many arguments that I would say, particularly from an atheist viewpoint, that seem to be an argument from silence. In other words, the argument for some atheists would be, I have had no personal experience with God, I have seen no evidence of miracles, I've not encountered God, I don't trust the stories of others who claim to have had such an encounter, so therefore God cannot exist. And often that seems like a very authoritative sort of stance, and I would beg to differ. I would say both positions require faith. But then if you think about it, how do you prove anything? Like if, for example, I say to my worldview students all the time, okay, prove to me anything at all. For example, prove to me that Adolf Hitler existed. Now, immediately their minds jump to, well, we've got evidence of Hitler, we've got eyewitness testimonies, we've got newsreel footage, and
Photos.
we've got, historical accounts, we've got, the influence of Nazi Germany in the world. But actually, I would then push back and say, well, you didn't personally encounter Adolf Hitler. You didn't have a personal experience with him. You're not an eyewitness. You are taking as verbatim what you've heard. I'm not a Nazi denier, by the way. I'm just making the point that proof is much harder, typically, than people realized. So let me just cite, I can give you immediately 20 very strong arguments for the existence of God. And I would say cumulatively, they are overwhelming evidence. I would say overwhelming. But let me just rattle off a couple of them. The argument from change, the argument from efficient causality, the argument from time and contingency, the argument from degrees of perfection, the design argument, for example, the idea of intelligence design that is so evident in the universe, the argument from fine-tuning. There are so many, just two, for example. Let's talk about fine-tuning. The fine-tuning of the universe is so intricate on every level of physics and chemistry that it is inexplicable in any other way but by design. The only way that scientists can grapple with that and ignore the existence of God is to postulate the idea that there must be an infinite number of universes, and we happen to be in the only universe out of that infinite number that actually can support life in the way that it does. Now, that is a ludicrous idea. And nobody would even remotely support that probability unless they were desperately trying to remove the need for the existence of God. But one of the greatest arguments for the existence of God is a very simple logical premise series. It's best known as the Kalam cosmological argument as postulated by William Lane Craig, and he echoes a Muslim scholar from the 11th century. And in that argument basically works like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, that might seem very simplistic, but the truth is cause and effect is basically a universal principle of science. We see cause and effect in everything. And the only time we try to remove cause and effect is in the beginning of the universe, because if we accept that the universe began, we must accept that there was a designer who predates it, who lives outside of time and literally breathes time and space and all matter and all energy into existence. So the Kalam cosmological argument is a very definitive and powerful logical premise, which some scholars would say is impeccable in its logic. What that means is that you can't gainsay it, you can't ignore it. Let me give you one other one. For years, I was told at school, for example, I was an evolutionary believer, if you like. I believed in evolutionary biology as I was taught at school. And why wouldn't I? That's what I was taught. But I was never taught the alternative, which is the act of special creation. So as I began to study it, though, I began to discover all sorts of flaws in Darwinian evolution. One of those, and probably I think the death knell of all of Darwinian evolution, is the principle of DNA. This is just one of literally dozens and dozens of proofs of the existence of God. But DNA is a killer for evolutionary biology. And here's why it is. Because the argument was that we evolved gradually over millions of years, or even billions of years, from the smallest protein, the smallest amoeba in the pre-primeval ooze of the earth. There was this amoeba that came to life. And out of that springing to life from no life into life, we suddenly see this process of upward evolution where infinitely more complex organisms arrive. Well, the bizarre thing about that, Matt, is that protein, we now know, had DNA in it.
Wow.
So even if you accepted that fossil journey, which I don't, by the way, it's a nonsense. It's not even true in the fossil record. But even if I did accept that, the existence of DNA in the smallest and most primitive amoeba, the smallest protein, the DNA is an infinitely complex coding machine. It's not just an information storage system, it's a design system. It literally designs itself. It replicates itself. It's absolutely mind-boggling in terms of its complexity. It's not a simple organism. It's an incredibly complex organism, and that's the most primitive organism we can find. So I laugh when people say, evolution is proven. I'd go, macroevolution is actually a completely flawed theory and is so untenable that we only hold on to it because we don't want to believe in God.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's fantastic. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, I believe that's what it is. Thanks again. I think part 1 I mentioned Year 9 science, and I just took ourselves back there.
I'm glad you didn't.
I'm just contributing.
I'm glad you didn't take that day off, actually. But you are correct. It's very nicely phrased.
Yeah. I did learn, Bruce. I might just add something in here, that the chances of an enzyme, which is a building block to DNA, just one, and there's a lot of science here, but the chance of that one enzyme, which is a part of the cell, and there's thousands of cells in the body, and the chances of that actually creating itself is 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. And if you want to do your own research as to what that number actually represents, go for it. You'll have a lot of fun with that. So I'm just going to drop that one in there. So I'm glad you mentioned it. There's a Greek philosopher, and his name's Epicurus, and he says this, Bruce. He says, "Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God?" Now, for a moment, I know there's a little bit in that, but would you please unpack that for us? What's Epicurus saying here?
Well, it's a great question. The first part of that is, is God, basically unable and unwilling? Then he's not all powerful. And I would say Epicurus's dilemma on the surface seems like a really good logical flow. The problem is he doesn't reckon with the idea of incarnation. And we're going to talk about that a little bit because we're going to talk about, God's intervention in humanity. You see, if God is absolutely remote and disinterested in the universe that he creates, which some people believe, then you would have an outcome where the universe, the evil present in it is just an outworking of the fact that God has created it that way or has no interest in the universe or whatever. It's a vacuum of, if you like, love. But I would argue that Epicurus' ideas are fatally flawed because he doesn't understand the idea of incarnation. Incarnation is the fact of, for example, that Jesus Christ literally is God in the flesh, in human form. And in becoming human, he takes on all of our human frailties and identities and challenges and so on. And so we're going to unpack that a little more in the rest of this program. But let me draw back to the comment you made about malevolence. Jordan Peterson, the Canadian philosopher and psychologist, speaks a lot about malevolence. And in his book, The 12 Rules for Life, he speaks about the fact that malevolence is a universal human trait. And he has no particular explanation for that, except that he would say that part of our challenge in life is to overcome the malevolence we see. And because part of this dilemma is always, well, if God's so good, why is there suffering? Why is there pain? Why is there death? Why is there all these things? And I think we need to engage with those questions individually to get an understanding of that. So, is God the source of evil?
Led me to the question, Bruce, because part one, again, if we go back to that, I asked you why God? Why did God create everything? And you spoke about love, as you sort of mentioned just, previously. You said God is love. He created us because he loves us. But as you just said, well, there is evil in the world. So, does that mean that God created evil? It's there. If God created everything, surely that's a part of it. Does that mean he is evil? We always hear that God is good, absolutely good. Well, is he?
It's a really great question, and one that, by the way, I don't think God is remotely upset by. I think part of our journey in unlocking faith is to wrestle with exactly these questions. That's why the Reasons to Believe series becomes so important. But let me go back to the thought about, if God's so good, why is there evil? Does evil exist? See, people would say, yes, there's clearly evil in the world, so therefore evil exists. My argument would be to analogize that. Does evil exist in the same way as heat exists? Heat exists as a property of thermal energy. So the greater the thermal energy, the greater the heat, the greater the radiation effect or whatever, you'll see greater heat. Does cold exist? Actually, it doesn't. Cold is nothing but the absence of that thermal energy. Similarly, we argue, does light exist? Yes, clearly light exists. We can plot the course of light. We can understand the energy and the properties of light. Light is clearly a thing. Darkness, by contrast, is not a thing. Darkness is the absence simply of light. That's all it is. And in the same way, evil does not exist. Evil is the absence of something other. It's the absence of, I would say, the love and character, the moral character of God. So where we see evil things take place, malevolence take place, it's clear that evil is present in the sense that love has departed. I would say love and evil are diametrically opposed. So it's not that evil is a thing, evil is the lack of a thing. For example, Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden and they have a test or a temptation to face. Now, in that process, the question is, was God tempting them to do evil? No. He was inviting them to make a moral choice as stage one on their journey of becoming in the image of God. But of course, they choose badly. And in the bad side of the choice, evil begins to take root in their heart as the lack of love for God and love for themselves, actually, in the right sense of the word. They become a lesser being. They didn't add to themselves some power by becoming evil. They became a lesser being.
Wow.
So God, I guess if we get to the core of this, really what we're saying is malevolence in the universe is no proof at all that God is evil. Quite the opposite. We would not know evil if we did not know that there was a goodness by which evil ought to be measured. C.S. Lewis highlights that thought by saying, you know, I had this accusation against God that God was unjust and unkind, but where did my sense of justice and fairness come from, if not from God himself? You cannot define a universe. We talked about this last in episode 1. You can't define a universe where morality exists if we just evolved by a random accident. The only way any morality of any kind can exist meaningfully is if it's designed by somebody who has an absolute morality.
So, Bruce, there's an opportunity, though, for evil to exist. So God created us knowing that there would be this opportunity for evil, for, as you mentioned, evil to shape or enter the hearts of man, and then we would become a lesser being. So, I mean, why? I mean, you know, God knowing that in itself, is that evil? Knowing that that could potentially happen? I mean, I know that that's a question that a lot of people have.
Oh, it's a fantastic question, Matt. I mean, because really what we're getting at there is the idea that somehow God has engineered this circumstance to compel us to fail. And I actually don't agree with that. What he's actually, because often people will say to me, well, God created the Garden of Eden in Genesis, and obviously he's created this world that's perfect. How can evil possibly then appear? That makes no sense. But I would argue he didn't make it perfect or evil. He made it innocent. And upon the foundation of innocence, we were called to build character, to add the virtues of character and love that are the imitation of Christ, the imitation of God. To be in the image of God means to be love all the time, in every circumstance, in every thought, in every word, in every action, in every belief. Love would permeate our being. That was the goal for God in creating us, because he's creating us to become like him. But of course, we don't start at that point. We're experiencing life in sequence, so we're always going to grow in our love. We're always going to grow in our virtue. We're always going to grow in our character, our sanctification. So in order for us to go on that journey, we have to start with a bare slate of innocence. Now, it's impossible for love to exist where there is no choice.
Yeah.
See, if God creates you in a garden, but he gives you no choices whatsoever, you have no capacity to grow and to develop. You can only be what you are at that moment. You can only be robotic. And by contrast to that, God creates a situation of temptation, one choice: eat or don't eat this mango, right? And so, of course, Adam and Eve look at the tree. They see it was, beautiful to the eye, desirable to make one wise, and pleasing to eat. So they went ahead. And suddenly they know good and evil, but they don't know it from God's perspective. They know it from a
Wow.
fallen perspective. So suddenly they become a lesser being. And in that sense, they imitated Satan more than they imitated
Wow.
God.
And out of that, I mean, it's to no surprise, you just have a look around the world today, we see suffering everywhere, pain. So if God is so good, even though, we made that decision, or Adam and Eve did, and then the flow-on effect, why is there still pain and suffering? I mean, sure, that happened, but why can't God just come down and change that? I mean, God is ultimately good. Wouldn't that be the desire of his heart? He is love. We still look around, there's anguish in the world, there's pain, suffering, decay, chaos. Why wouldn't God just come down and take that away from us? Why does it still exist if God is so good?
Wow. I mean, that's a brilliant question, and maybe we'll finish with this one today. Because, suffering deserves, an enormous focus in its own right. Suffering is probably one of the most profound of all challenges and questions about faith. And I can understand why many atheists feel that the world they see is too painful for there to be a good God. But I would respond to that by saying that, well, let me give you an analogy. Not an allergy.
I don't want any of those.
I'll give you an analogy. To analogize that, I had an experience as a new Christian. I was out surfing one day, and I was surfing with this other guy, and he said to me, "Oh, what do you do?" And I said, "I'm working with young people in a youth refuge in King's Cross in Sydney, and we're trying to take people off the street." And he asked me why I did that, and I said, "Well, my faith informs my worldview, and I want to make a difference in the world." And he basically said, "You can't tell me that you believe in God." And I said, "Well, I do believe in God." And he goes, "Well, how can you possibly believe in a God who allows evil in the world, who allows suffering?" And then he goes, "How can you believe in a God who allows refugees?" For example, at that stage there was a crisis in Ethiopia, and he described these Ethiopian refugees, God's to blame. And I didn't know how to respond, because I'm a new believer. I don't really know much about anything. But I'm sitting there, and I felt the Holy Spirit whisper to me, "Ask him what he does." And he said, "I'm an agricultural scientist." And I said, "Wow, so you know how to produce food from even arid situations?" He said, "Yeah, that's really what I do. I'm primarily focused on developing healthy agricultural outcomes." And so I said to him, "Well, here's the interesting thing. You could get on a plane and fly to Ethiopia and make a difference in their world by bringing your skill set and literally helping them to heal their land." And he was horrified. He was like, "Well, I couldn't do that, and that's ridiculous." And he went on for a number of reasons why it was impossible. And at that point, I felt this word of wisdom drop into my soul. Do not accuse God of not doing what you are unwilling to do. In that moment, it's like I realized that there are some things we're waiting for God to do when God has already sovereignly commanded us to do them. The interesting thing about the vast, vast majority of suffering on the planet, and this can be well documented, the vast majority of suffering on the planet is not God ordained, it's human designed. The vast majority of suffering on the planet is because of man's inhumanity to man. We either sin by omission or we sin by commission. As Jordan Peterson highlights, there are sins of malevolence where people literally abuse and rob and destroy the lives of others. There's also sins of omission where we, in our utter selfishness, will not share what we have with those in greater need. The Bible is very clear about the principles of fairness by which a society ought to function. Jesus made it clear to us that to the one that is given much, much is expected. We live, Matt, in Australia, probably in the top 3 or 4 wealthy nations in the world. We have received blessing upon blessing. We live in utter privilege. We live in the top 2% of the world's wealthy. And that obligates us to alleviate suffering in the world. Now, if we choose not to do that, we can hardly blame God for being uncaring. The reality is that most realms of suffering are human caused. But even more than that, you mentioned before, shouldn't God come down and do something? Shouldn't God somehow engage in our world? Well, he did. And he didn't just come down. He didn't just have a look. He took on human form. He literally, to answer Epicurus's dilemma, he literally was so engaged with the world that he took on human form. He faced every test and temptation we face, yet without sin. And in the process of that, he carried our weaknesses, our sicknesses, our suffering. He suffered himself on the cross. He was abused, betrayed, denied, spat upon, and died a human death on a cross unfairly executed. He carried the death, the epitome of all suffering, on our behalf.
Wow.
So in that sense, Epicurus's dilemma is answered by a God who is incarnate, a God who intervenes, a God who is not distant from his creation, but is intimately involved. And in that sense, there's hope for all of us.
Yeah.
Because even in the midst of our own suffering, we have someone who identifies with us in a way that we could never have imagined, and in more depth than we ever faced. So we're left with the idea that God's love compels him to create us, but God's love further compels him to redeem us. And in that sense, we are twice loved. We're loved once because he designed us, he's our maker, and he loves us more than any parent could love a child. But we're twice loved because he didn't just love us in that way, he loved us enough to buy us back from our own faults and failures, and to create a pathway to be restored to the image of God, but now with an understanding of grace. A grace that Adam and Eve could never have understood. So in the midst of all of this, is there suffering in the world? Yeah, it's horrible. It's terrible. And the only good news about that is it's temporary. And if I could finish with this, Matt, the great news about that is that even death is a doorway of hope, not a doorway of judgment.
Yeah.
Because in death, we have the opportunity to return to our perfected selves. We become once and for all fully in the image of God, which was always the plan.
Wow. What a great way to finish. Remembering that, well, it wasn't God who created suffering, but God actually chose to suffer on our behalf so that we could be redeemed. And then when death being the worst possible experience that we could have, it actually is the door into the best possible outcome, eternity with him because of Jesus. That's just amazing. So, hey, thanks, Bruce. Thanks again for another insightful part of the series together. Just really quickly, if someone wanted to engage in some further reading, who are some authors that they could look into? Are there any quick resources? I think of Tim Keller as one personally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we would love anything that Tim Keller writes, actually. He's a brilliant, not only apologist, but also pastor and leader and professor of philosophy. one of the books that I have been using a lot in preparing for this series is called The Reason for God. And look, it's just brilliant. And I think it answers, for your generation especially, they have so many questions, and good questions, questions that deserve an answer. I think it would be great to read a book like that. The Logic of God, as I've mentioned previously, by Ravi Zacharias. And there's probably a couple of others that are very devotional. I also just wanted to recommend, not specifically a Christian author in her own right, but she has a very strong Christian ethos underneath what she writes. That's Brene Brown. She writes about the power of vulnerability and, particularly the influence of shame. And I would encourage every person to read Brene Brown on that topic. But yeah, thanks for joining us again.
Cool. We'll see you next time.